Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our 2021 annual conference. My name is Sasha Mooney. I'm a professor in soil physics at the University of Nottingham, and I'm also the past president for the British Society of Soil Science. Today's annual conference is titled Soil Health from Principles to Practice, and we have 5 fantastic speakers lined up for you over the next few hours who are going to share their knowledge and expertise in the areas that they work in. This year's aim is going to provide an insight into a very prominent topic at the moment, with many different views and perspectives and ideas on what determines a healthy soil and how this can be achieved and assessed in practice. So our 5 speakers today will discuss their connections with soil health, highlight its importance, and discuss some of the next steps to help raise awareness and explain how we can all make a difference in the work that we do. Before that though, we're delighted this year to have a sponsor. This is Arcadis, who are the Society's first corporate member. And I'd like to welcome Matt Gardner to the conference, who's the Business Director for Site Evaluation and Remediation at Arcadis. And he's going to give us a brief introduction into why soil health is so important to them as a business. So over to you, Matt.
Thank you very much, Sasha. Good morning, everybody, and similarly, welcome to the Society's annual conference, as said, sponsored this year by Arcadis. Well, Arcadis is a multinational, multidisciplinary, and a multicultural consultancy. We have a very well-established environmental consultancy business embedded within that whole team. I mean, alongside our engineers, architects, cost consultants, and project managers. But nevertheless, even with that more learned group being embedded, I think it's fair to say that Arcadis, as an organisation, has experienced an awakening to the challenge of climate change through global warming, much the same as the rest of the world. Unexpected events, mega trends such as rapid urbanisation, they're putting pressure on our communities, the cities, resources worldwide. And as a business, we want to maximise our impact by harnessing technology, data, research, innovation to develop solutions for our clients to meet those global challenges. I've seen a huge growth in awareness across our business, and it's reached areas I wouldn't normally expect it to be to reach, quite frankly. Less said about who that might be, the better. But it's almost comforting to feel that everybody is almost sort of gaining that awareness, gaining that sense that there is an urgency about this now. But in researching what our business can do and what our clients are doing and what the challenge really is, I mean, the enormity of the challenge is growing as the understanding develops. The complexity of achieving what appears to be a very simple goal on paper of just reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It's often terrifying due to the range of factors that must be considered. You know, the overall complexity of the environment, the interconnected linkages, synergistic, antagonistic relationships between bodies and groups, and of course the need to change decades of baked-in human behaviour. So, I mean, communication is paramount in delivering the latter part of that communication, and conveying complex science facts to a global population has been and will continue to be a challenge, increasingly so when other parties have counter opinions that serve their own needs. But as a consultancy business, we're focused on that, improving the way those messages make it through to our clients, the importance of it to people in general, improving the way resources are utilised, protecting the environment, creating sustainable solutions such as in transportation, and creating places where people can enjoy working and living in a more sustainable way. And one of those things that's sort of come about this year, and in these goals and amongst our various propositions to our markets, we can see that soils and soil health is absolutely central to achieving sustainable development, to achieving net zero, obtaining, creating those healthy communities and more. My background lies in contaminated land. I've been with Arcadis for 11 years out of my 20 plus in the industry, and you know, in contaminated land, when you describe something as organic, it usually means that it's a sort of petrochemical product and it needs to be hoovered out of the ground. And even that's being reviewed from sustainability measures these days. And in much of my work in preparing land for development, I look back with horror. You know, topsoil is largely an unimportant commodity to be stripped, stockpiled, just left in a heap for a few years, and then reused on a piecemeal basis in people's back gardens as and when buildings are constructed. And actually, it's more the thickness of the topsoil rather than the quality. I mean, it's not great to look back in hindsight. And very little was undertaken to protect the quality, you know, the content, the structure, and so on of the material, and even less care given to what the gardens and the open spaces might actually achieve. Certainly, there were or have been missed opportunities to improve that element of development and regeneration. But anyway, I hope as understanding grows, particularly in soil science, foundation, and the need to change everybody's behaviours, the world, the global population's behaviours, and need to change accelerates. I think the understanding of soil as that vital resource will improve the degree of protection it receives and the enhancement that can be achieved, and hopefully result in a far more sustainable world. And I'm very pleased and delighted that Arcadis is sponsoring this event today. I trust today's programme of expert presentations will continue to steer us down the path towards that sustainable future. And yeah, thank you, and have a great conference. Back to you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Matt. So before we begin the conference, some basic housekeeping for everyone. As we have so many people on the call today, we're going to keep all the microphones muted. We will be taking questions at the end of every presentation and also on our panel discussion. These questions are going to be asked on your behalf by our colleague Dan. Could encourage you to send questions throughout the presentation rather than waiting to the end, as this will allow us to get through as many of those questions as possible. If we don't ask your question after the presentation, please don't worry, because we have a panel discussion then, and we'll roll as many of the questions over onto that part as we can. There is a raise hands function, but we will not be using that in the conference today unless the speaker specifically asks for that. Please note today's conference has been awarded BASIS and NRO SO CPD points. So if you need to receive those, please just contact us after the event and we can get that sorted out for you. And finally, please note that we are recording today's presentations. Okay, so without any further ado, I would like to move on to present and introduce our first speaker, Professor Jim Harris. So Jim is a systems ecologist who principally works on soil microbiology, restoration ecology, and ecosystem services research, focused on microbial ecology in relation to ecosystem services. He's applied this particularly in the assessment and treatment of degraded systems for restoration equality, quantitative assessment of ecosystem goods and services, and he's pioneered work on the catabolic profiling and thermodynamic processes of soil microbial communities. God, Jim, this is a bit of a mouthful. This work has advanced our understanding of the effects of environmental management, soil microbial community, and provided better tools for assessing ecosystem status. Also the effects of land management and, importantly, restoration programs at enhancing natural capital to achieve environmental gain. Jim has worked on defining and assessing soil health, which is why we've invited him to speak with us today, by the measurement of biological, physical and chemical properties. He's worked extensively at national and international levels in terms of policy development, acting as a scientific advisor to DEFRA at the IPBES meetings in Colombia, Rome and Bonn, lead author of the IPBES report on land degradation and restoration, and a past chair of the International Society of Ecological Restoration. Oof, I managed it. Over to you, Jim.
Well done, Sasha. I'm just working out how I share my second screen. Oh yeah, there it is. Can you see it?
Perfect. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay. Thanks, Sasha, for that flawless introduction. And it's a real pleasure to be speaking today and opening the conference, and Sasha invited me several months ago to do that. It's around a subject that's incredibly important for us, not only in policy, but as perhaps a platform, and that's what I'm going to talk about, of soil science, and taking soil science into a much broader audience than perhaps we have in the past. So there we are, a new look at soil health. Why soil health? Well, it's a phrase that is adopted by the scientific community in the 1990s as a means of summarizing the effects of different land uses and management, which are either beneficial or degradative. But it's actually, the term goes back right to the early 1900s, and people were talking in general terms about soil health even then. But then we really got into discussions and collaboration with policymakers in all the nations that are active in soil health, and policymakers and regulators want something that they can use in explaining to their constituents, who elected officials, etc., and how that might be used in long-term plans. And certainly in the last few years, we've got to the position where soil health is now front and center in many national policies, and nowhere more so than in the United Kingdom, with it being in the environment plan. The problem we've then hoist ourselves with our own petard is very often those policymakers would like a single number for ease of use, and that number's going up, or it's going down, or it's staying the same, because they want to use that in monitoring. So ideally there'd be some kind of way in which we could simply deploy this number and deploy a piece of kit to say, well, this soil is definitely getting healthier, or it's getting sicker, or it's staying the same. And the sort of dreams of having a Mr. Spock's tricorder to be able to point at a soil or a soil system and easily gauge its condition is something that many of us aspire to. Wouldn't that be nice? So what's the problem? Well, the problem with the term health is it can really only be understood in terms of an individual organism or system, and the ability of that system or organism to persist in the face of perturbation. The term ecosystem health suffers from the same conceptual challenge, and I'll take you through some of those that are in the way that I see them. You know, let alone people are now talking about the health of organizations, the well-being of entire nations. We hear everything is now an ecosystem and the ecology of a business, and that kind of thing. I hear it quite a lot in my work with colleagues at Cranfield across the different cognate areas. Well, soil isn't an organism, and then we have to ask ourselves, is it a system? And I think this is perhaps, we've been approaching this from different places, but this might be a wellspring for future work that's going to be globally important and cutting edge. So our challenge is to understand the importance of continuing to use these sort of metaphors in the public understanding of science and their deployment in monitoring and management, but without reducing the science so that it actually becomes meaningless, because that can happen. So in a nutshell, soil's not an organism. We're not sure we can even identify it as a system, and I'll explain why I think that's the case and the kind of challenges that we have to face and tackle. So we've got to ask ourselves, can it have such a thing as health? The usual approach to measuring described soil health has been focused on simple point measurements in situ of varying sophistication, and some of those have been incredibly helpful in providing land managers ways of monitoring what they're doing and the effects of what they're doing. And then there's some sort of very complex determinations, such as metagenomic analysis of samples taken to the field to the lab, and physico-chemical characteristics, and there are various degrees of difficulty with deploying those in a way that's cost effective and immediate enough to actually provide what the land manager is looking for. And also, it's also an opportunity, and this is in these two areas is where the scientific community has really been looking at soil and in the context of soil health. But do we need to move from measuring characteristics directly to measures of systems organization, which are dependent on the biology, shaped by the physico-chemical factors and their interactions and interdependencies? There are lots of ways out there, and ecologists have been tackling this kind of thing, computer scientists, biologists. A lot of the work that's being done across biological systems are equally applicable to the system that we're interested in. There's lots of ways in which complex systems, emergence of scale, multifunctionality and self-organization have been described and measured. Collective behavior, synchronization, swarm behavior, the kind of things you see with starlings, a murmuration of starlings changing direction as almost like an organism. Networks, things like graph theory, adaptive networks, evolution and adaptation, genetic algorithms, machine learning, pattern formation, dissipative structures, and I'm particularly interested in that in terms of the thermodynamics of the soil system, spatial fractals, and I'm going to mention a little bit about that from someone else's work in a bit. Systems theory, homeostasis, the ability of a system to maintain its internal state. This is very much something that came out of the work of Odum, or the Odums around mature systems, having this ability to, in some ways, maintain their own environment and their system state, and it's certainly the basis of Gaia theory. Information theory, nonlinear dynamics, population dynamics, time series analysis, game theory. Evidence for self-organization in soil is appearing in the literature. That's supposed to be, that's John Crawford et al., Andy Neal et al., 2020, 2011, 2020. And so I'm just going to touch on little bits of evidence, although mainly I'm going to take us through the sort of the conceptual space that we're dealing with. We've got some evidence for complexity, and this is recent work by Neal et al., which includes Sasha and others, in one of the most elegant figures that I've seen in the literature on regards to soil in recent years. I'm really big fan of this and the other figures in the paper, but I really love this. And essentially what we've got here is the relationship between connected porosity, hydraulic conductivity, and the amount of organic carbon in the system. And at one point the authors say that there's an indication of emergent coherence and fractal scaling, and fractal scaling is an indicator of complexity in a system. So we're already starting to look at complexity as something that perhaps I contend presages the emergence of properties of systems. So what might we do? Well, there are a number of measurements that we're already taking, but I think perhaps we need to go beyond that, and we're starting to see that appear of sort of the signs of life. That's something that we've been doing a lot, addressing ways of characterizing and identifying biology of soils and whether they're simple or complex, stochastic or deterministic. Signs of function, ways of transforming energy and materials. Is it efficient? Is it able to respond to a wide or narrow range of inputs? Is that function flexible? Are there signs of feedbacks and connectivity? How are those things interacting? Are they connected? Are they complex? And signs of resilience, although I'm going to go broader than resilience in a second. Can we determine the persistence of relationships in the face of perturbation? This is all around soil's ability to maintain its state in the face of that perturbation. Is the system able to absorb those kind of shocks that are traditionally coming along, but now increasingly coming along with our changing and more stochastic environment? There's a sort of a hierarchy of organization here, and there's evidence in the literature from things like ecological succession and certainly in restoration ecology, where we can see these things take a time to develop in this kind of order. and again, I'll explain the conceptual space of that in a moment. We've got lots of measurements that we do now almost routinely with DNA, metabarcoding and what have you. PNFA has been going for a long time for signs of life. We've got catabolic profiling, process measurements, community structure, trophic connections, giving us ideas of feedback and connectivity, and then signs of resilience. And we're starting to look at responses to applied perturbations, because you can really only get to this final tier of organization when you start to look at things in a dynamic context. These are not point measurements. You have to take them over time series to see the effect of the way in which the system responds to the environment and changes the environment. And then there's lots of things that are popping up now. VOCs, recent paper by Brown et al. Showed that this is a volatile organic carbon signatures, how they might tell us something about the state of the soil, the thermodynamic efficiency, and then we're still really getting into things that puts us right at the cutting edge of science, physics. Tom Addiscott, who I had lots of conversations with many years ago about the number of large to small molecules in a system, because organized systems like to tidy things up into large molecules. Fractals, we've got some evidence of that in that diagram I just showed. Zipf's law and emergent properties, all the way through to 1/f noise signals. And in an organized system, you tend to see few large perturbations and many small ones in an organized system. And you can see that in everything from stock markets to road traffic movements. So if you imagine we've got these systems that are starting to organize, and if I can just take you to the barren wastes of Surtsey as it emerged from the sea, what happens? You get pioneer species turn up. It's all the same species because they're uniquely hardy and able to take on that first niche. And then perhaps we start to see other species come in. But there's very little diversity in the first one. There's no diversity. They're not connected to one another. It's not a complex system. Then you can start getting some diversity in the system. And then you start to get some indirect connections between them. There's quite low complexity still. There's sort of a weak emergence going on. And then as you start to get things like direct predation and what have you, this system is starting to build up these feedbacks, and they're starting to interact in response to a perturbation. And then finally we get strong emergence when we're starting getting real knitting together of the ecosystem. And here's an example from our work that we did in restored sites in the Netherlands, in the Vingerveld, between 2013 and 2017. And essentially what we're looking at here is the emerging networks of plant taxa and fungal taxa in response to restoration treatments. And this is very interesting because very often there are in different nations different approaches to restoration, and one of them is the so-called build the field and they will come. So essentially you scrape the topsoil off and then you let it develop as a system. It doesn't always produce a speedy result, and we were looking at what happens when you add hay and what happens when you add soil from your target system to sort of inoculate the system. And sure enough, that was what started to build these networks and connections up far more rapidly than simply leaving it to its own devices, because you've got the whole business of where the propagule's coming from and what's happening. And that's quite important to then put that in the context of the scale of the system that you're looking at, because if you're only looking at a very small part of a system, you might get some idea of the bits of complexity, but you're not going to detect any emergence. As you go up the scale, you'll be able to see more of the system and therefore greater complexity, but little or any emergence can be detected. It's only when you're looking at the whole system, and this is critically important, what scale do we look at things, can we then start to see truly system properties? And that's the challenge. Do we have a system? So if you imagine you've got these inherent properties, physical, biological, chemical in soil, What are the system properties? There's the complexity of the system. There's lots of work that's being done to look at the complexity and system, and from that function. And then finally, and this is where I contend we need to be looking, is emergent properties, and we are starting to do that. So here's something that we did at Highfield. Lindsay Todman, Fiona Fraser did all the heavy lifting here, but several of us were involved in the project. And we identified that these 3 types of respiratory responses, type 1, 2, and 3, and it's to do with a number of peaks that you get after you add substrate to a soil. And what was really interesting was that then when we looked at a couple of the systems that were had been under various sorts of management at Rothamsted, and we did a series of dry and wet cycles, and over the course of those wet and dry cycles, we looked at what respiratory response was there. Was it still there? Had it changed? And taking to the, I'm going to pick the 2 most contrasting here. In the arable system, it seemed, because both the arable and grassland had that type 1 response, but after these cycles, the arable appeared to have been, at least for the time being, after 12 cycles, shifted to an alternative state, whereas the grass system had returned to its previous state. So it had adapted and maintained its conditions and pumped back to the top. So that's interesting, very interesting observation. So what can we do with this kind of approach? These measurements would inform a conceptual model with respect to life function, complexity, and resilience, from simple communities to complex, from ability to carry out a number of simple transformations to a rich and diverse set of traits, connectivity from isolated individuals and populations to highly connected and interdependent communities, and then this homeostasis, is it can the system control its environment? So you can imagine this sort of trait space from poor and simple, to complex life, poor to rich function, isolated to networked communities. And is this succession? Does succession work like this? So why start with resilience? What constitutes enough resilience? It's important for us to understand that as an emergent property, and in many ways it's the most acute. And at this point, I'd like to say that there are 2 sorts of resilience. There's the resilience of the system that keeps it in the functional state that we're interested in, but actually after degradation, and I was really interested to hear about, the way in which organic matter is treated for understandable reasons on reclamation sites, you can end up with a system that is actually unhealthily resilient. And this is the sort of contrast between a living parrot and a dead parrot. If you've got a dead parrot, it's incredibly resilient because you can't do anything to it that's going to make it any worse. And that's quite important. This is work by Fath et al, and this has come out of economics and economic theory, and then moving into sort of ecosystem type understanding, because you need to have resilience right in the middle of the diversity and connectivity. Otherwise, what happens, you can end up with a very brittle thing and it falls apart, and that's where we've been squeezing efficiency into, or been aiming for efficiency and ended up squeezing out the buffering and complexity, and therefore the ability to respond. And then unhelpful resilience is this rigidity. So there's a sweet spot in the middle we need to aim for. So in a nutshell, again, resilience is an emergent property of complex systems. If you can't detect emergence, and it could be any one of those other properties as well, they're all valid to be exploring, you're either not measuring the right dynamics, you're simply not looking at something which is a dynamic that is characteristic of the system of interest. You're either not looking at the right scale, or, and I think this is our biggest challenge, you're not looking at a system. Is it a system? If we claim it's got health, we've got to demonstrate that it's a system. That's my contention for today. We need to be looking at systems properties. We've got many more systems. Are soil systems actually like this? What scale should we be looking at? We've looked at all kinds of classifications, from aggregates to bed structure to what have you, horizontal structures. Where are the boundaries of the system? This is so incredibly important. Does resilience increase as we move from these poor isolated communities to those rich interconnected ones? Does a combination of events plus new information push the system along in a succession stroke organization pathway? And there's lots of other questions we can explore as a community and are exploring, because we don't want to leave it too late. There is a real danger that if we don't start getting this right, and sometimes it's simply going to have to be pragmatic, and that's where those field measurements that can be easily used by land and soil managers are so useful. We may get to the state where it's, in many cases, it's simply too late. And I just want to thank all of those people I've had discussions with. I'm sure not everyone is on there, but this has risen from lots of discussions with many people. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
With your stern face.
Thanks, Jim. That's the perfect presentation, not only in terms of setting us up for the morning ahead, but also perfect timing. So thank you for that. So Dan has been monitoring the questions coming in. So we're going to take a few. We've got a couple of minutes. I'm going to hand over now to Dan.
Thank you, Sasha. Good morning, Jim. Got a couple of questions here then from the delegates. And the first one is, how do you think soil fragmentation as a result of habitat fragmentation makes it more challenging to restore soils, given that most soil biota can't move as much as above ground biota?
Wow, that's an interesting question, and I have to say, I wonder about that, because you know, there's quite a lot of propagules moving about in rainfall, for example. When you're coming to those biota that are more dependent on those interconnections like mycorrhizae, then it can be a real problem. Although I've seen work where mycorrhizal spores can move, but for some species that are specialists, unless you're connected right next to the system that you're aiming for, it's incredibly difficult in a very long time period. So yeah, I think that fragmentation in every aspect of ecosystem science and conservation is incredibly difficult, because if you've got something isolated, and you only have to go back to MacArthur and island biogeography theory, then you end up with a restricted pool of propagules and a restricted set of possibilities for adaptation, because a lot of the adaptation system comes from things arrived from outside. And I was hearing this morning on BBC Radio about dragonflies of beneficiaries of global climate change, because they've extended their range and they're finding new habitats. For some soil species, it's very difficult. For others, I think there's a lot of distribution of propagules by soil scientists and ecologists wandering from one site to another, and it's all on their boots. So perhaps we should be doing more of that.
Exactly. Thank you, Jim. Just a reminder to people, if you want to add your questions into the questions tab, we'll try to get through as many as possible, but if we can't get through them, we can save them for this morning's panel discussion. So there's another question here about trends. After 20 years of monitoring, which is quite a long question, I'll try to truncate it. 20 years of monitoring, trends in data are as important as the magnitude of the variable. For a regulator or policymaker, the trend shows if a policy is working or not. So Jim, could you comment on the use of trends and the whole system?
Well, I think that that's absolutely critical, because as I said, a simple point measurement at one time is only going to get us so far about the state of the system at the moment. The trends will tell us whether this system is accumulating organic matter. We've seen the importance of organic matter in maintaining that beautiful curve that has come about in the soil pore space. So I think that trend data is important. The drawback, of course, is if you wait too long, your trend might turn from a beautiful upward curve into a sudden collapse. So we really need other indicators to go alongside that, that you can push the system to try and see whether this really is recovering or are we looking at something that's a bit of a false dawn? And of course, the thing is, we can create an ecosystem in the lab in a mesocosm or a microcosm, but trying to get that measurement out there is where the challenge lies. But trends are incredibly important, of course they are.
Thank you so much, Jim. Well, it's time for me to hand back to Sasha. Thank you, Jim, for those answers. I've got lots of other questions that we can put to the panel discussion, but for now, thank you, Jim. I'll hand back to Sasha.
So thank you, Jim, for a brilliant presentation. Really appreciate that, and also for Dan for chairing that session.